You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the East-West Center in Washington. Delighted to have you here today. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the Center, and I also direct the Washington office. I think you're in for a real treat today. We've got two outstanding experts on Northeast Asia in general and Korea in particular. You have their full bios, so in order to maximize the time for the program, I'll just introduce them very briefly, but we have as a special guest, all the way from Cambridge in the UK, we have an Associate Professor, Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, who's the Korea Foundation Korea Fellow and Senior Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House as well. So he has a dual hat, so he's in the kind of think tank community as well as a professor. And I've known John for a long time. We've done some work together on the Korea-based journal Global Asia. And so delighted to have you, John. Thanks for making the time and offering to come here and speak to our audience, both in person here and online, on this very important topic of the Yoon administration's foreign policy. We have as a discussant today someone who's well known around Washington, Dr. Scott Snyder, who's Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Many of you know Scott has been laboring in the field of Korea studies for a long time, and we always count on his expertise and his insights as well. So thank you, Scott, for making the trek over across the way to here. And we're going to do 30 minutes for John. John's going to lay out his case for sort of where the Yoon administration's foreign and security policies are. It couldn't be a more opportune time, given all that we're hearing about from North Korea, debates in South Korea about nuclear issues, about the U.S.-Korea alliance, U.S.-Korea-Japan coordination, and not last but not at all least, are issues about technology alignment, including on critical technologies. So it's a really, really opportune time to have these two experts here. And I turn it over to John, and then followed by Scott with some comments, and then we'll open it up to the floor for any comments or questions. John, welcome, please.
Thank you very much. And Satu, thank you for hosting me. Scott, thank you for acting as discussant. Thank you, the audience, for coming. Let me begin also by thanking the Korea Foundation for supporting the work that we do at Chatham House on the Republic of Korea, in fact on the Korean Peninsula in general. The remarks I'm going to give today in part derive from a couple of pieces of work that we've been doing over the last 2 years or so, looking both at the role of South Korea between the United States and China and the challenge of managing those two very important bilateral relationships, but also a recent extended piece looking at the question of domestic politics and the contestation between the left and the right broadly defined in South Korea, both as a historical phenomenon and more recently. And I hope it will become clear in the course of my remarks why the domestic dimension is arguably important for thinking about foreign policy where South Korea is concerned. So to begin with the kind of obvious presentation of South Korea's foreign policy, even before he took over as president, candidate Yoon, back in February of 2002 in the pages of Foreign Affairs, was setting out the nature of the foreign policy that he envisaged for his administration, a policy in which he emphasized the importance of clarity and boldness. The reflection of that was this articulation of South Korea as a global pivotal state, one in which there would be much more emphasis than had arguably been the case under the previous administration on strengthening ties with the United States, on cooperation with so-called like-minded allies, on the importance of reinvigorating trilateral partnership between Seoul, Tokyo and Washington, and a general movement away from what had been seen by conservative critics as a rather excessive preoccupation with the challenge of North Korea on the part of the Moon administration with its focus on peace building and engagement. Some of that has been framed in, and I come back in making these observations, to domestic politics. Some of it is being framed as an effort to move away from what might be viewed as an overly ideological approach to foreign policy. Tae-hyo Kim, the Deputy National Security Advisor, in a recent piece in Washington Quarterly, made quite a bold, strong argument to make the case that the left has been overly focused on an ideological agenda. He talks in his piece, which he co-authored with Bernard Rowan, about the tendency on the part of the left, and particularly what he calls the 586 generation, politicians in the sense that reflect the approach of former President Moon, of being too preoccupied with the need to reach out and re-engage with North Korea, and being driven by a rather Manichaean style of politics that doesn't allow for a more nuanced approach to thinking about foreign policy. The more recent reinforcement of this new approach, as the Yoon administration would frame it in terms of foreign policy, is of course the strategy of a free, peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific region, published in December of last year. And it's worth perhaps reminding us of some of the key elements of that approach. South Korea is an open trading nation, a focus on future-oriented partnerships, so an expression of a desire to move away from contentious historical issues that have sometimes bedeviled relations with, most notably, Japan. A focus on inclusivity and partnership, a desire to be seen as both a regional and a global actor. And I think a very important element of the report, a commitment to, in the words of the report, to working with every part that is aligned with our vision and principles of cooperation. And I'd like you to keep that in mind, because I'll come back to that in thinking about what that actually means substantively. As part of this initiative, 3 core principles: inclusiveness, reciprocity, and trust. And I think trust is probably one of the most important elements when we think about not only relations with adversaries, but also with allies, and I'll come back to that. It's a very ambitious program. This is the Indo-Pacific strategy. Of course, it doesn't tell us about the broader agenda, but even within that framework, in what is admittedly a very extensive geographical space, there are 9 core lines of effort for the new government. Building regional order, promoting the rule of law and human rights, strengthening non-proliferation and counter-terrorism, expanding comprehensive security, building economic security networks, boosting cooperation on science and technology and in the digital space, leading regional cooperation on climate change and energy security, tailored development, cooperation, and finally promoting mutual understanding and exchange of personnel. So that gives you a flavour of the scale of the ambition. Certainly bold, I think, by the terms of that important foreign affairs piece. It also inherently moves away from what has sometimes been referred to as a policy of strategic ambiguity of previous administrations, and certainly the outgoing Moon administration, sometimes described by some observers as a policy of double alignment. And if you look at the statements of some politicians, back in April 2020, for example, Moon Hee-sang, the Speaker of the National Assembly, likened the choice between Washington and Beijing, between the United States and China, as akin to choosing between your parents. You can't really choose between mum and dad, he said, given the importance of trade dependence that South Korea has on the Chinese market. Equally significantly, a long-standing veteran of policy-making in South Korea, Chung In-moon, the current president of the Sejong Institute in Seoul, very explicitly said that South Korea would have to reject any idea of participation in the Quad, or any idea of engaging in some sort of proto-military cooperation against China, because it would expose the country to, in his words, existential risk. And of course, for South Korea, preoccupied with the challenge of North Korea, China, because of its alignment with the DPRK, because of where it sits, because of its economic influence, is often seen as a key player in delivering a settlement of the North Korean issue, if that were to become possible. So, why the need for a policy of clarity and boldness? Beyond the obvious need on the part of any incoming administration to define its policy in original and distinctive ways, there are, of course, a whole range of factors internationally and regionally that highlight the importance of a new approach. It is a truism to say we live in a time of great uncertainty and global change. To list some of the obvious expressions of that uncertainty, the very core values of the liberal democratic order are under challenge, given the polarization between democracies and authoritarian regimes, particularly at a time when, if you accept the views of people like former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, when we look at countries like China, we are seeing a return of ideological motivation, and the willingness of Xi Jinping, for example, to embrace a set of tenets that are a reflection of basic Marxist-Leninist values, re-engineered, if you like, for the current situation. And of course, with Russia and the tragedy of what's unfolding in Ukraine, we have a president seemingly motivated by revanchist notions of territorial ambition that reflect, some would say, a rather irrational approach to geopolitics based on notions of nostalgia and national myth. And these changes seem to reflect a marked shift in the way global politics is being played out. Out of that, of course, comes energy insecurity, as well as the persistence of non-traditional security threats such as climate change and global terrorism. And perhaps most important of all, in terms of thinking again about the domestic determinants of policy change, arguably a decline in the relative capacity of individual states, wherever they might be, whether in Asia or in Europe, to manage these challenges. And part of that comes out, I would argue, of an increased tendency towards political polarization within individual polities, certainly within liberal democratic states, as populations turn inwards, whether in response to declining levels of relative economic prosperity and a perception that their own material conditions are being threatened by the shift of geoeconomic centre of gravity from Europe and North America to East Asia, or perhaps the emergence of migration as an immediate threat to the sense of security at home, all of which is in turn fueling what the Indian-British writer Pankaj Mishra has described as a new age of anger and resentment. If that weren't sufficient to create this impetus for a new set of policy proposals, global economic commitment on the part of many actors seems to be no longer something we can take for granted. The Bretton Woods system is arguably facing challenges as states embrace a more state-centered approach to economic policy making, with doubts about the reliability of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, and the temptation on the part of national leaders to focus on promoting national champions rather than promoting free and open free trade. For these changes to be happening at a time when, in the wake of the Trump administration, notwithstanding the Biden administration's commitment to alliances and engaging in foreign affairs, it's understandable that there would be doubts within the region, within East Asia, on the part of actors, including South Korea, but also arguably Japan, about the reliability of America's commitment to act, in the words of previous writers, as an indispensable superpower. So fear of an American first revival 2 years hence might also provide an added impetus for the South Korean government to think again. The optimistic, if you like, silver lining in this cloud of uncertainty is the emergence of greater activism, greater appetite on the part of many states, as Mike Green has described them, tier one states such as Japan, and arguably, and it's open for discussion, a country like South Korea, to engage in the process of strategic thinking. And we've seen very powerful examples, Japan perhaps being a notable one, of individual politicians and civil servants putting in place the institutional mechanisms for thinking about national security decision making, dating back to 2013 in the establishment of the National Security Council in Japan. Even my own country, the United Kingdom, through its all-of-government approach via the integrated review, has arguably been trying to grapple with this question of thinking strategically about foreign policy priorities. So my question in looking at South Korea today is to ask, is this bold and clear statement of principles, genuinely bold, and clear. Is it a form of strategic innovation? There's no doubt that the need for a new set of policies is powerfully felt, but is it truly strategic? If by strategy we mean the attempt to harmonise ends and means, are those ends clearly defined? And does South Korea have the means to meet them in a way that is proportionate and strategic? So the case in favour of the argument that this is a clear and bold set of initiatives can be supported through a variety, I think, of points of view. Certainly in terms of declaratory policy, we've seen a real appetite on the part of the President's office to make the case, and I've cited some of those already. We've seen public statements last year in September at the UN General Assembly by President Yoon, which talked very clearly about the importance of values, the rule of law, and South Korea making contributions to supporting those values. And we've also seen in bilateral meetings, the first summit meeting between President Biden and President Yoon in May of 2022, a reference to Taiwan, a real departure in terms of South Korea's willingness to take a stand on issues that might reflect some of those basic values. At the diplomatic level, a proliferation of bilateral and trilateral meetings that give real heft and weight to this ambition to strengthen ties between Seoul, Tokyo and Washington at all levels of government, defence, foreign policy, the intelligence community. We've seen efforts on the part of the South Korean defence industry to engage in supply chain cooperation with their American partners. In September of last year, the third meeting of the Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group, hugely important in providing that reassurance that the United States will remain committed to meeting the immediate security interests of South Korea. And in November, of course, in three critical meetings, the East Asian Summit, the meeting of APEC in Thailand, and of course the G20 process, we saw further confirmation of these important trilateral meetings between key officials and leaders of the three governments, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. And there's no doubt that the initiative is not purely coming from South Korea. There are other actors who are willing to step into this space. Taro Aso, the former deputy prime minister, a key figure in the Japanese government, was recently in Seoul for discussions with the foreign minister and the South Korean president. And in the case of some of the personalities involved, we have individuals with an international profile. The South Korean foreign minister, Park Jin, himself a Japanese speaker, trained in Japanese politics. One might argue that these personalities are naturally well placed to deliver on this ambitious agenda. I've mentioned economic cooperation briefly, but of course we've seen, particularly in the semiconductor space, real efforts building on the Biden administration's Build Back Better initiative to try and, again, add weight to these forms of bilateral cooperation. And then finally, when it comes to military cooperation, trilateral submarine exercises between Japan, the United States and South Korea. South Korea sending a ship to participate in Japan's fleet review recently, an important departure. Cooperation between the South Korean and US Navy in exercises designed to address the threat from North Korea. Major aircraft exercises, Vigilant Storm, between South Korea and the United States. And also tabletop exercises to deal with the increasing nuclear challenge that North Korea represents. And of course that nuclear threat, we're all familiar, 17 missile launches plus in the course of the last year, and very importantly, this new declaratory policy from the DPRK, embracing the idea of a potential first use of nuclear weapons by North Korea, as well as, importantly, the suggestion that North Korea may in fact have acquired tactical nuclear weapons. All of those have created real anxiety and arguably a step change in the way South Korea, in the leadership talks about how best to respond to this challenge. With President Yoon dramatically, of course, talking about the possibility of South Korea needing to embrace the idea of a reintroduction of nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. If you look at the public opinion polls as well, the South Korean public seems receptive to these ideas. Much more concerned about the threat from North Korea, but also, as Ji-wook Shin at Stanford University has described in some detail in recent papers, also much more concerned about the security threat from China. signalling, I think, a real shift in attitudes at home. So, superficially, it seems that the direction of travel is very much in a way that confirms some of that declaratory policy that the Yoon administration has embraced. But I want to argue that to frame it exclusively in these ways is to exaggerate the potential. So what's the case, if you like, for the prosecution to criticise this approach? Well, first of all, I think when we look at past South Korean administrations, we see plenty of examples of innovation in foreign policy making. It is almost a given that every incoming administration will seek to embrace a slogan, a concept, an idea that defines itself from its predecessors, whether it's MICTA, NAPSI, the new Southern policy, the new Northern policy, Sunshine, and all the variants of Sunshine that emerged after the 1990s. And that's inevitably, one might argue, a function of a one-term presidency and the desire on the part of politicians to distinguish themselves from their peers. It's also, I think, important to point out that however much the Yoon administration wanted to define itself against the idea of balancing, this is not the preserve of conservative politicians. We've seen Park Geun-hye in 2015 trying to formulate a strategic partnership with China. It's also fair to say the left can be inherently pragmatic. It was a progressive president, President Yoon, in 2003, who authorized the dispatch of troops to Iraq. And multilateralism is sort of hardwired into the foreign policy making process of South Korea. Victor Cha at CSIS carried out a recent extended survey to sort of demonstrate the evidence for this multilateral agenda. My own colleague in Europe, Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, has made similar observations. And as recently as the G7 summit in Cornwall in 2021, we had further confirmation that South Korea, under a progressive government, has been able to occupy that space on the international stage. The danger, I think, in taking this rhetoric at face value is what I would call the danger of fetishizing small differences between administrations. And some of that comes out of the intensity of partisanship at the domestic level. While this last presidential election was very close in terms of the vote turnout, I think for many of us observing the intensity of the political conflict, it was striking how divided the forces of left and right remain in South Korea, and the extent to which what some people might describe as almost, and I identify neither side of this debate as having a particular claim to present things in this way, but there is a kind of general climate of political intolerance of your opponent. Politics is a zero-sum game, and we see that in the way in which the Special Prosecutor's Office is being used. And of course, the current president comes from that tradition. Now, to what extent does that narrow the bandwidth for foreign policy making if your agenda is too dominated by domestic politics? To what extent does that close out real foreign policy making opportunities? South Korea is not alone in this. I would argue that we see this sort of trend in many countries, in Europe, in my own country, where we've had 3 prime ministers in this many months. And the risk of this polarized politics persisting is that sentiment, to come back to Pankaj Mishra, feeling, anger, resentment, will drive out or eclipse rational, coherent decision making. We've already seen the current leader of the Democratic Party, Lee Jae-myung, criticize the government's overtures towards Japan. We've even seen Conservative National Assembly members who, in a past existence, and I'm thinking here of Tae Yong-ho, the former North Korean defector to South Korea, have been very critical of North Korea for obvious reasons, starting to advance more pragmatic policies and finding that his own party members are unsympathetic to this idea. So entrenched are the ideological lines that divide left and right. And with the National Assembly, of course, still controlled by the Democratic Party, there's a legitimate question about what the government can get done if it wants to get its agenda through. How much strategic innovation is possible when the domestic environment is so polarized? If one looks across the East Sea, the Sea of Japan to Japan, one could argue that much of the strategic change in Tokyo has been partly because there is an emerging cross-party consensus on the legitimacy of these pragmatic responses to security. And of course we have a dovish Prime Minister in Prime Minister Kishida, who precisely because of his if you like, soft progressive credentials within the LDP, can embrace a more hawkish agenda. I have, I think, about 5 minutes, is that right?
Sure.
So, is this policy truly strategic? To come back to that core question. It was Paul Kennedy in the 1990s with some co-authors who first framed the phrase pivotal state. But he was talking about states operating in a variety of regional contexts. And for me, one of the problems about the global pivotal state is where is the axis? Where is the pivot? Is it a regional pivotal level, or is it global? That seems to me something that needs to be spelled out in the strategic framework. It's also hugely ambitious. And it's not clear what the balance is between regional and global agenda items for the government. Yes, the Indo-Pacific strategy might seem to be suggesting that there is, albeit a broadly defined regional focus, becoming more central to what the government is doing. But even here, it's questionable to what extent the Indo-Pacific strategy is really a sharp departure from the new Southern policy of the Moon administration, which first introduced the concept in 2017, but by 2019, in conjunction with the United States, was already moving in a direction to embrace the sort of activism that the Yoon administration has been calling for. And even within that strategy, and arguably still today, there's a tension between regional initiatives and a focus on bilateral partnerships. When one thinks, for example, about the close relationship between South Korea and Vietnam, it's an open question about how genuinely regional this approach is. What happens also if the values that President Yoon has talked about so ambitiously at the UN and elsewhere conflict with some of those partner states? To remind you of the quote, we will work with every partner that is aligned with our vision and principle of cooperation. So, when you have states which are non-democratic, whether it's Vietnam or Myanmar, or when you're addressing the issue of human rights in Hong Kong or the state of the Uyghurs, where will the South Korean government come down on those critical issues? This also seems to be a strategy that, at least as far as the Indo-Pacific proposal is concerned, is uncosted. How is this very ambitious agenda going to be sustained and paid for by the South Korean public? And what is the institutional capacity of the South Korean government, particularly given the limitations of the one-term presidency, going to come from in order to generate some of these bold initiatives? Jeffrey Robertson, in a recent piece, was very critical of the Indo-Pacific strategy for not essentially having that institutional framework and an inadequate National Security Council decision-making format or an equivalent in South Korea that would allow these difficult choices to be made. And how are other countries responding to this initiative? Andrew Yeo, in looking at, for example, the response of countries in the region to some of these initiatives, has pointed out that there's a lot of skepticism within Southeast Asia itself, public opinion, quite not critical, at least not inherently recognizing the importance of these initiatives and not giving South Korea the credit for what has been achieved to date. And then the issue of trust. Remember, one of those 3 pillars in this new initiative. Even when we look at the US-South Korea relationship, the debate over the Inflation Reduction Act and the way that has played out in South Korean media reporting is indicative, I think, of a profound lack of trust between certain players in South Korea and the United States, despite all the efforts by the Biden team to stress the importance of those alliance relationships. Sometimes rhetoric is not sufficient to really build that level of confidence. And when one comes to the question of the choice between Washington and China, as I'm sure Scott will talk about, aren't we actually still seeing some evidence of precisely the sort of balancing process we used to see under previous administrations? China has not been excluded from the new Indo-Pacific strategy. President Yoon is himself calling for a reactivation and re-energization of the trilateral partnership between Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul. So what has really changed? And as we saw in the South Korean response to the Pelosi visit, sometimes when you have to make difficult decisions, you're going to offend someone. But critics might argue that that important decision was fudged rather than confronted directly. There's more that we could say, but I'll finish on one final point, which in a sense is quite topical today if you've been looking at the South Korean press, just the question of Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine is arguably a powerful litmus test of the extent to which President Yoon and his team can deliver on these critical values. But of course, there are worries about antagonizing Russia. South Korea has been very forceful in embracing sanctions and in condemning the invasion of Ukraine. But some writers have observed that the response within Korea, whether it's at the National Assembly or at the level of public opinion, has been relatively more muted than you might find in other countries. And even the supply of critical military technology. On this issue, the indirect approach of providing howitzers and artillery shells to Poland rather than providing direct assistance to Ukraine itself is indicative, I think, of the difficult choices, the dilemma that the Yoon administration faces. So my conclusions, yes, it's ambitious. Yes, there is a vision. Yes, there is clearly an appetite to engage in ways that reflect that ambition and vision, but perhaps we need more clarity and less boldness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was a really terrific insight, and I particularly appreciated your structuring of this as the affirmative case and the kind of more questioning case. We're going to turn to Scott for some comments, but just to lay up a couple of things that intrigue me. One is really the balance between how you frame the forward-looking nature of this strategy, this innovation of the strategy, and the balance between the polarization domestically and the factors that have led to this. You cited a number of factors that led to this strategic innovation in the world, regional, global change, global requirements. But that it was kind of not a footnote, but this element of political polarization, which is going to win out because Korea's material interests are being affected by these global and regional factors versus this kind of, what you seem to describe as a fairly narrow bandwidth of political polarization, room for change there. But these are going to come to a head, especially on China, I think. And so maybe I just would plant with you this, what's the balance between political polarization and these material interests that have created this quite strategic looking policy, even if not in practice? And when does the rubber meet the road for Korea? When do they have to make some real choices? They're going to go along this way on this because otherwise they're in a heap of trouble, whether it's trade dependency or others. Anyway, let us now turn to Scott. Scott, thank you.
Well, John has given us a very nuanced and very comprehensive presentation, and I'm glad that he ended on an optimistic note. I wasn't sure where things were going to come out, and that may also reflect some of my own ambivalence about South Korean foreign policy, and especially my ambivalence about the domestic political context, the context of domestic political polarization. And what really stands out to me in that context is that every South Korean administration, as it approaches foreign policy, I think grapples with another gap, and that is the gap between aspiration to make a difference, both domestically and globally, and an atmosphere of constraint. And especially for South Korea in its neighborhood, I think that those constraints are very real. And for that reason, I often end up thinking about the way that the two sides in South Korea express their own foreign policy views as advocating for the same policies, but from very different rationales. That in fact, in many cases, because of that atmosphere of constraint, South Korea, I think, ends up going in a particular direction that is much less dramatic than the way it might be advertised, or than the differences might be advertised between the two sides. And so that's part of what I grapple with. But I think that the challenge there is that we also see increasing capacity And historically, I think it's easy to think of South Korean foreign policy as constrained because in a context where South Korea didn't have much capacity, it truly didn't have many choices. But now we see that in addition to aspiring to be a global pivotal state, it's the 10th largest economy, and it's probably the only economy in the top 10 that is actually raising their hand to try to do more on the international stage, and might actually have some resources to do it. We know that the broad backdrop is one of resource constraint. And so, those are some issues, but I also wanted to address, just very briefly, some of the specifics. Well, let me just say one other thing. So because I see that there's an atmosphere of constraints, the way that I look at the shift between Moon and Yoon, especially if we think about it in the US-China context, is we see a shift from strategic ambiguity, characterized by choice avoidance, and tactical clarity, de facto alignment with the United States under the surface, to one of strategic clarity, in which now South Korea is proclaiming its alignment with the United States in many different areas, combined with tactical ambiguity, shown in the way that Yoon dealt with Pelosi, and shown in the way that South Korea has to manage its dilemmas of supply chain resiliency. It wants to be closer to the U.S. and wants to be integrated with the U.S. economy, but at the same time, semiconductors is still 30% of really large China-South Korea bilateral trade, and that means that there are real costs that South Korea faces connected with its choice to invest in the United States. And so it means that there is nuance and complexity, I think, as related to South Korean choices. And it's, I think, revealed in the Indo-Pacific strategy very clearly because, talking about inclusivity, that's actually a holdover from the Moon administration. And it's not aligned with the idea of China being a peer competitor. Talking about reciprocity, well, I think that's actually more about South Korea's desire for reciprocity in an atmosphere in which it faces asymmetries of power. And with regard to trust, when you start to think about it, as John had pointed to a little bit, it's kind of hard to tell whether the trust that South Korea wants in its Indo-Pacific strategy is trust related to China or trust related to the United States, right? Because we have a burgeoning debate. On the one hand, under Moon, you could worry more about North Korea first policy, over-focus on North Korea. But now, under Yoon, we have another autonomy debate related to should South Korea have its own nuclear capabilities, right? And so those are tensions. They've always been there between alliance and autonomy, but now as South Korea has greater capacity, it also seeks greater agency. And that is a challenge for the alliance. It's also good for the alliance in the context of the competition with China, but there is definitely an ambiguous aspect to it. And so maybe I'll just stop there. There's a lot more that I, had thought about saying, but, really, I think that pretty much covers it in terms of kind of my reaction to talk.
Thanks. I hope we can develop this strategic ambiguity to clarity versus tactical ambiguity to tactical clarity to tactical ambiguity. That's very interesting if some of those big strategic innovations are going to occur, because it's going to have to occur at the tactical level, right? You're going to want to have to do more of these exercises, more of this interoperability, and more of this planning horizon. But let's, we have about, I think about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, so I want to make sure that we go to the audience. Please identify yourself and speak loudly for the microphone because we are live streaming this event. Let me start there in the back.
We just speak up.
Yeah, please,
Okay,
you can
very
stand
good.
up if you'd like.
Stand
Introduce yourself.
Nobody ever mentions economics. South Korea, not alone, has a demographic problem with the economy. Too few younger people to support the older people. In order to stave off collapse, South Korea has to move its labor force from the public sector to the private sector. And these people who will be net generators of tax revenue as opposed to consumers. All this talk about defense moves people from the private sector to the public sector. You never see this discussed. It's like the train's going to collide. How do you resolve this problem?
Okay, we'll take that question and one more here, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I saw in Global Asia a very nice display of Korea's balancing act between China and our interest in getting them on board with respect to the defense of Taiwan. And it wasn't particularly optimistic from our point of view. Of course, Japan can help in two ways. It can actually assist with military assets to fend off the Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or it can simply allow us to use its bases without actively participating. Let's go to Yoon, South Korea. Will it, at a minimum, allow us to use those bases without actually participating? The other thing is, I'm not convinced that we can track a submarine, North Korean submarine, from the Bohai Bay, from hydrophones in Korea, from hydrophones in Japan, from hydrophones in Taiwan, to hydrophones in South China Sea, because of our failure to coordinate Japanese and Korean relations. What are we going to do about that?
So you've got three questions, one about the demography and impact on Korea, one of those material constraints, one of these constraints, so it's not even regional, but internal. And these two specific questions about options given our current agreement with Korea on use of U.S. troops in Korea can't be used beyond the peninsula. That's really well. So what are the other alternatives if Korea is going to make this strategic innovation to be aligned with the U.S.? That's kind of tactical clarity.
Yes,
That's a tactical clarity.
it is.
Right?
Do you want me to
Please, start away.
Well, I suppose, the demographic question really does bring us back to voting behavior and how individual voters are going to look at this proposal in terms of the costs it's going to require in terms of resources, and whether they actually can, and whether, when it comes to making a choice in terms of your political allegiances, whether you're going to be really influenced by those material considerations. I'm encouraged by the way the election was played out, and in a way, I suppose one of the things that was striking was the extent to which, even though there was a lot of this positioning on foreign policy, in terms of welfare policy, the middle ground seemed to be something that both sides of the debate were willing to hew to, and that's maybe one reason why the vote was so close. There wasn't really much to choose between the candidates in terms of their domestic agenda. And so it seems as if voters are, as they do in Japan, voting in terms of their kind of economic priorities, first and foremost, and dealing with those immediate concerns. The worry is what happens when you have a foreign policy issue that, in a sense, intrudes into that space. And the Japan-Korea example, I think, is a good one. And it's the very tempting one that politicians reach for when they feel politically at a disadvantage. And I do worry about that. And I do worry about the sort of broader trend that we've seen in so many other countries, or a type of tribalism to infect the way in which voters make their decisions. Brexit, of course, is a shocking example of that, of where the material evidence seemed to have so little purchase in the way individual voters made their decisions. On the other hand, I suppose a kind of mediating influence is the extent to which, and I'm not a sociologist, so I'm hesitating to make a pronouncement on this, the extent to which Koreans feel collectively that they're part of the same to say the same community is a bit woolly, but feel that you don't have that sense. It's sometimes been observed in countries like the United Kingdom. David Goodhart, the British sociologist, said, the split between anywheres and somewheres. It seems to me that one of the great benefits of South Korea's soft power is that Koreans seem to identify with this idea of having a global presence, and that kind of reinforces your point, Scott, about there being more capacity to feel engaged internationally. And therefore, perhaps those polarizing tendencies are more limited to the politicians themselves and less to ordinary voters. That's a partial way of addressing your question, I hope. But, on the issue of Taiwan, I think, again, the gap between rhetoric and what can be done, when we think about the question of strategic thinking, the timeline, the time horizon, identifying the likely, not only the opportunities and areas for developing new policy initiatives, but the proximate risks. And we all know all about the predictions about a potential clash, whether it's 2027 or perhaps sooner. Surely this should be an area where decision makers in South Korea are thinking about what might be done, whether it's providing an opportunity for the deployment of US forces. As part of that, there needs to be a serious thought about transferring operational control to the South Korean military so that they can simply handle the immediate strategic interests that they face on the peninsula. But of course, there are lots of other things short of that which could be done. Arms exports, and beyond declaratory policy, I suppose more economic engagement with Taiwan. But my sense is that this is so problematic and so difficult to engage with that you're not going to see much public domain discussion of this. And people I speak to who go to Korea to try and explore this issue find the doors are closing, they're not really open, because maybe this reflects just how difficult the issue is. On the issue of tracking, again, I'm not a military specialist, but we have seen much more evidence of a willingness to revisit the idea of intelligence cooperation. Whether either of these countries, either Japan or South Korea, have their own capacity to provide the level of reassurance that will be needed in order to really share that technology and that information is a big it. On the issue of tactical ambiguity or tactical clarity, as it's now perhaps emerging, the Pelosi visit, I suppose for me the interesting question is, what was the thinking within Yoon's foreign policy team in terms of their assessment of how this would play here? To what extent their own ability to read what's happening in the White House and the likely response to an independent branch of government deciding to pursue its own agenda. And that's maybe partly a function of the strength of personal ties, the amount of contact, the amount of awareness of what's happening in terms of those discussions. But those are my immediate thoughts in response to the question.
And maybe Scott, you can take this up too, but really, one metric of the strategic innovation, how far it can go, how long, sustainable it is, to me, is Japan. And one thing that keeps being remarked on by friends I talk to in Korea, in Japan, in the US, is that interestingly, the public response on Japan has been fairly muted about its announcements on counterstrike, on doubling its defense budget, on moving nuclear. So the question is, notwithstanding where the politicians are, is the public going to be moved on this issue in the political polarization? You brought this up just now too. I'm wondering, is there a point where we'll be reached where there's not much payoff politically to, if you will, playing the Japan card?
But there also has to be a willingness on the part of players on the Japanese side.
No question.
To make the concession that would provide the face-saving solution.
No question.
And maybe it comes back again to the perception within Korea that sometimes, as we saw with Park Geun-hye's rapid rush to seek a solution to an issue that didn't need to be really solved at that stage, that produced the problem in the first place, right? the agreement between her and Abe. Sometimes, I'm reminded of Im Sun-nam, the then Vice Foreign Minister, having to go and deliver in public, on television, the government's policy on the issue of conflict women to the survivors, the victims. And it strikes me as odd sometimes that political leadership can believe that a settlement, whatever it might look like, is simply going to fly with public opinion. And so therefore I'm skeptical that I think there's a danger that you underestimate the depth of feeling on issues that obviously are deep-seated. Even the proposed South Korean solution, some sort of payment system that does not involve the Japanese companies, there is, I think, precious little likelihood that there will be an apology coming out of it. And if that's what some of the advocates and the interest groups in South Korea want on the forced labour issue, I don't think it's going to materialise. So that's I think a real constraint, and I don't think there's an easy solution. The only other thing I would say about the Japan example is, with Japan having made so much progress, to come back to Mike Green's assessment of becoming a very self-evident tier 1 power, the power, if you like, of competitive pressure to be seen to occupy that space if you're a South Korean government official, with Japan being so proactive and so engaged at so many levels and delivering and actually making the political and diplomatic weather, it may be that competitive dynamic itself will fuel more appetite to do more.
Scott, over to you.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. I'll just make one comment about the demographic issue, because what occurred to me is that the question might really be, can South Korea afford to be a global pivotal state because of the growing welfare burden that is created by South Korea's demographic transition, and because of what it means for the need for South Korea to enhance technology dependence rather than rely on human capacity in terms of its military. I think that with regards to Japan, this is really interesting because in some ways I think that it is actually as much about the emergence of what have almost become structural impediments to normalization of a Japan-South Korea relationship versus the geopolitical forces at hand, with the U.S. leading on the geopolitical force, trying to put allies together in a trilateral context. And we'll have to see how that plays out. But I do agree that I'm not sure that President Yoon would have been so proactive in advocating for a normal relationship with Japan if he had not also felt that public opinion has shifted in this way, in this area to some degree. And so I actually think that it's the structural impediments that are the really hard things. The fact that we have court judgments from the Constitutional and the Supreme Court that have created obstacles that are very politically challenging to overcome.
Interesting. On Taiwan, do you want to say anything? What is your reckoning? I mean, we had John's answer, but what's your reckoning on inclusion of the Taiwan statement in the 2+2? Not the 2+2, the U.S.-Korea joint statement.
It's progress for it to be there. But I think that not much beyond that has been worked out. I do think that South Korea now recognizes that as an ally, any military conflict across the strait would inevitably make them at least vulnerable because of the hosting of U.S. bases. But my first response when I saw that Pelosi was not going to meet Yoon was to think, well, I guess Yoon better not ask for an address to Congress if he wants to come back to Washington and have a visit. But it turns out that that particular cost is no longer relevant right?
to new Congress.
So, I mean, the level of discussion on this issue, I think, is sufficiently dense that I'm not sure that there is going to be a huge price to pay, but I do think that it is notable and does represent a form of hedging in practice. Although it's true that she came directly to Seoul after Taipei, and so the spotlight was really on whether or not they might meet. And of course, there's also the diplomatic excuse of, well, he was actually supposed to be on vacation, not in Seoul. That was the reason why the meeting hadn't been set up. But, you know, honestly, if they wanted to meet with each other, they could have made it happen. So.
Thank you. Let me go back to the audience. Any other questions from the floor? Yeah, Russell, please.
Great. Russell Shell with the Global Taiwan Institute. I won't ask a Taiwan question since you already answered it. But this has to do, my question, either John or Scott, would welcome your comments and thoughts, is views about changing perceptions towards China within South Korea, and specifically with regards to whether or not you see any concerns within South Korea about PRC influence operations there. There's been growing concerns throughout the region with regards to PRC United Front operations here in the United States and other parts of Asia as well, but other methods of propaganda, disinformation, or elite capture issues, whether that has made it to the sort of the discourse within South Korea's sort of defense and security discussions, and perhaps your thoughts on whether why those such concerns are there or not, right? So, any thoughts on that, please?
Well,
Ron, kick us off.
yeah, I'm tempted to say Scott's going to know much more about this than I do. I don't know about the propaganda issue, but there was an interesting piece by Oriana Scala Maestro recently making the argument when you look at Chinese naval activity in the Yellow Sea, there is a much more tangible and obvious security threat there, which is exercising the thinking of some South Korean military planners. And that, again, might sort of provide an opportunity for greater coordination between the US and South Korea. And why is that happening? And why is China willing to take those steps to engage in tactics that are different from what happens in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, but nonetheless are an attempt to assert its naval presence? It seems hard to imagine that, given all the projections, even notwithstanding the concern about securing Chinese cooperation in any potential deal with North Korea, that there wouldn't be an appetite to focus on those questions. The propaganda issue, certainly when I look at the debate in my own country, has become much more pronounced recently. British government officials, the sanctioning of British academics. How much of that is a legitimate concern? How much of that leads to an exaggerated response when it comes to the presence of Chinese students in British universities? But I know certainly that there are prominent British politicians who now are increasingly warning about this risk. One area, I suppose, which is obvious in the South Korean context where this would play prominently would be the question of technology and the presence of Huawei. And I don't know what the current status of Huawei's investments in the South Korean market are. But that's certainly been a big concern in European countries, of course.
There is one South Korean company that had been using some Huawei products, LG Plus, and I'm not sure whether they have fully divested or not. But on this issue of Chinese extra legal presence, the main story has been about a building with a Chinese restaurant that has not seemed interested in serving customers, and also has other offices in it that have doors with no apparent names on them. And so, this issue of trying to make one's presence felt beyond the traditional internationally legally certified channels is there. In some ways, I think some of those issues have actually been eased in South Korea by the pandemic because there's fewer Chinese students in the South Korean universities right now. And because that would obviously be the other population of interest as related to some of these activities.
But if I understand correctly, as China begins to open up for travel, Korea has expressed interest, as have other countries in Southeast Asia, in a return of Chinese tourists and students. Is that the
I
feeling?
think
in
there's an
Korea?
expectation, but right now the issue is that South Korea is very quick to put restrictions testing restrictions on Chinese tourists.
Oh, I see.
And there was a reciprocity action by the Chinese that has kind of dampened the
Enthusiasm.
opening in the initial phase. And of course, those are probably going to phase out as the situation changes, but there was a little bit of a mutual political cost as the Yoon government was very quick to follow the U.S. lead on that.
I don't see any other questions, and we are at time, so I'm going to just say, is there one last question in the back? Yes, please.
Yes, this is slightly off the subject, but it's not really. It's a follow-up on the gentleman.
Could you just speak a little bit louder, please, so the audio can pick you up? Yeah.
Okay, so this is slightly off the subject, but it's related to the question that the gentleman asked about Korea's declining population. China had hoped that its population would probably increase, especially during the COVID period for the most part, but that was not the case. And statistics have shown, at least according to a report that I read recently, that the population has declined more so, significantly more so in the last couple of decades than they had anticipated. As China becomes more aggressive on the world and global scene and making headways in a lot of places in other countries like in Africa, blah, 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 how does China expect to continue strategically to implement that kind of political program if their population and resources begin to decline?
Well, we have two Northeast Asia experts. I don't know if you feel comfortable answering a question about how China will behave. Demographic decline.
I don't want to put my
Yeah.
head above the parapet on that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Scott, do you have any thoughts on?
I'm not sure I see a direct relationship between, or a real-time relationship between democracy and international projections of influence.
Of power and influence, yeah. So maybe please come back for our China seminar, and then some of our experts on China could maybe think about how demography might affect Chinese international behavior. So, but thank you for your question. Listen, thank you all for being here. Thank you, presenters. They'll be here for a couple of minutes after. I think they have a little time to stay on, but again, their books, if you want to get their books and their writings, the more details are provided in the full bios, and I'm sure they can point you to the right place. But John and Scott, as always, great to see you, and thank you for your time, and thank you for your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.